It's no longer news that France has lost its influence in Africa, especially given the fact that over 70% of African countries where France formerly had its military troops have sent France packing. However, in one of his recent interviews, President Traore of Burkina Faso revealed something striking. He said that contrary to what France wants everyone to believe, France has not truly left some countries. Now, at the time Traore said it, some people thought that Traore was just taking another hit at France. But now we can see that Traore was right. In Ivory Coast, where the French military has supposedly left, there remain about 80 to 100 French troops in the country. The question is, what are they still doing there? Have French troops truly left the Ivory Coast? Let's find out. In December 2024, the president of Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara, in his end-of-year address announced that French troops would withdraw from the country. According to him, the move was a reflection of the modernization of the country's armed forces. This was after Senegal had announced in November that France would have to close its base on its territory. Now, at the time he made the announcement, Ivory Coast was home to the biggest remaining contingent of French troops in West Africa, with about 600 military personnel. When he made the announcement, it came as a shock to everyone because Ivory Coast has been a strong ally of France. Both countries have maintained strong economic, military, and even political ties since Ivory Coast's independence in 1960. Beyond this, the president of Ivory Coast is a well-known puppet of France. So, the idea that France would want to withdraw from one of its strongest allies in West Africa, especially at a time when it had lost influence in the Sahel, was strange. However, the announcement was made that France would withdraw from Ivory Coast, and everyone believed it except President Traore and his supporters. Then came February 20th, 2025, when France supposedly officially handed over its last base to Ivory Coast. Prior to this day, it was reported that the majority of French troops had left the country. In the handover ceremony, the French and Ivorian defense ministers signed an agreement to officially return a military base to Ivory Coast, shortly after the Ivorian flag was hoisted in the base's parade ground. The entrance to the former French base now features watchtowers painted in the Ivorian national colors of orange, white, and green. But here is where it starts to get interesting. The French flag is still hoisted and flying in the base, and according to Tene Birahima Ouattara, the Ivorian defense and state minister, about 80 to 100 French troops will stay in the country to advise and train the Ivorian military. The Ivorian president also said something striking. He said, "The world is changing and changing fast. It's clear that our defense relationship also had to evolve and be based more on future prospects in the face of the realities of threats and those of a world that has become complex in terms of security and not on a defense relationship inspired by the past. France is transforming its presence. France is not disappearing." The French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu also commented that with a changing world, it is natural that the military relationship between the two countries should evolve. He described the base's handover as a historic moment, reflecting a relationship built on friendship and professionalism. "The presence of France is changing, but not disappearing," he added. Before we proceed, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. Now, doesn't this remind you of what President Traore said in his interview? According to Traore, France has not left. It has simply changed tactics. If you think about it critically, you would notice a huge difference between France's withdrawal from the Ivory Coast and that of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. First of all, as Traore said in his interview, if you want to break up with these imperialist forces, it's simple. We denounce the agreement. It all starts there. I think that the example of Chad in any case is palpable. They started by denouncing the agreements. Otherwise, if we don't denounce the agreement and just say that the base is leaving, we haven't done anything. Think about it. Before France agreed to grant independence to Francophone Africa, they had to sign what we now know as the colonial pact. The colonial pact signed between France and the African colonies maintained French control over the African states' economies. It took possession of their foreign currency reserves. It controlled the country's strategic raw materials. It stationed troops in the country with free passage. It demanded that all military equipment be acquired from France. It took over the training of the African police and army. It required that French businesses be allowed to maintain monopoly enterprises in key areas such as water, electricity, ports, transport, and energy. France not only imposed import restrictions on a variety of commodities from outside the franc zone, but it also imposed minimum volumes of French imports. These are just a few of the numerous agreements signed between France and Francophone countries. Our focus here is the military agreement, which ensured that France was in charge of their military. Now, before the Sahel countries kicked out French troops, the first thing they did was denounce the defense agreement with France. After this, they announced that French troops should leave. But nowhere did the president of Ivory Coast announce that the defense agreement between Ivory Coast and France had been dissolved. In fact, in another speech, President Ouattara reassured France that military cooperation between the two countries would remain robust. Secondly, when France withdrew from the Sahel countries, it left nothing. But in the case of Ivory Coast, France left about 100 troops to remain in the country. According to them, these troops are to advise and train the Ivorian military. But there is something Traore said about French advisors in his recent interview. Traore said, "The problem is in the colonial agreements signed since independence. The most dangerous are not the ones you see in bases. The most dangerous are the military advisors who exist in all these countries. They existed in Burkina Faso until the end of 2022 when we took responsibility. But who are these fierce military advisors? These are the ones who are supposed to put France's policy into practice. They work to make our enemies very weak so that France can always have the argument to exist here. Under Blaise Compaoré, they succeeded." Still speaking, Traore said, "That's what France wants from our armies, and when we get to this stage, we don't have a choice but to want them to settle." However, the Burkinabe army managed to get rid of these French military advisors. Unfortunately, I think that in 2010, after the operation at Tapuano, when the French saw that the Burkinabe army still had the capacity to react to terrorism, they called the Burkinabe chief of staff to France and instructed him to take back the military advisors in the whole structure. He didn't accept. However, when he came back to Burkina Faso, the corrupt Burkinabe politicians told him to accept the military advisors, and that's when these military advisors returned to the Burkina army in 2019. It was a disastrous thing to do because the army started disappearing in the following years, 2020 and 2021. This was when many Burkinabe soldiers started deserting the military because there was no hope. We were collapsing. This is how the French advisors work in the army. They dictate the policy of the Burkinabe army. It is they who tell us how many to recruit, when to recruit, and what to do. They are also in the schools to tell us how to train the soldiers. As long as these military advisors are there, you are not independent. Your army will just have the appearance of an army that will be doing parade circuses. But when the war comes, you will realize that parade is one thing and war is another thing. We have to break the agreements. This is the only way to have an independent army and to build and be strong. But many people may not understand this. With these agreements, France chooses military officers who will go to train in France. The reality is that after training, these officers come back to their countries to serve the interests of France. These are deep words from President Traore and reveal the stake truth about France's influence in the military of these countries. It explains why, under French influence, these militaries are among the weakest in Africa. There is no doubt that those 100 French troops are simply an extension of the French military presence. It's no wonder they said that the presence of France is changing, but not disappearing. With all this, it is quite clear that France has not withdrawn from Ivory Coast. As an Ivorian writer, Tape Grubera clearly states, the fact that France recently announced its withdrawal from the Ivorian base in Port-Bouet does not change the situation, that Côte d'Ivoire still remains a department of an occupying country. The 1961 Franco-Ivorian colonial treaties, which allowed Paris to intervene in Côte d'Ivoire, even to go into its subsoil and extract what they wanted, are still in force, he emphasized. According to Grubera, it is wrong to say that military bases exist to provide security. On the contrary, they exist to provide insecurity in Africa. Therefore, Western military bases, not to mention all bases foreign to the territory to Africa, must leave the African continent. All foreign bases that are not African bases, in our opinion, in our vision, must leave African territory, he argued. Another Ivorian writer, Sylvain Taku, noted that authorities of Côte d'Ivoire are well aware that the withdrawal of French troops is a sham, and the French army will never leave the West African country as long as the 1961 Strategic Economic Cooperation Agreements remain in force. If these unjust agreements are neither denounced nor annulled, legally or legitimately, Côte d'Ivoire will remain what it is, the property of France that Côte d'Ivoire has always been. That is, nothing more than a territory and its wealth unjustly appropriated by a former colonial power 6,000 kilometers away, the writer pointed out. All of these are simply what President Traore predicted. According to Traore, General Tiani said not long ago that France simply decided to change its tactics and strategies in Africa. This new tactic is about dissolving some certain elements but keeping a strong foundation in Africa. And it seems that Ivory Coast is the weapon that France wants to use to maintain that strong foundation. It is quite pathetic that an African nation will readily avail itself to be used as a weapon in the hands of a foreign country. This is what we mean when we say that African leaders are weak, unpatriotic, and greedy with no ambition. Take a look at France. Does France have any foreign military base on its soil? But Ivory Coast has readily accepted a foreign base. How pathetic. African leaders are so weak without any iota of backbone, and that is why more than 13 foreign countries have a military presence in Africa. These Western countries include the USA, France, the UK, Germany, and even India. Yet, there is no single African country that has any military base outside the continent. The question is, why do so many foreign countries have military bases in Africa? First, for resource exploitation. Africa is the world's second largest continent in terms of landmass and population, with a large range of important natural resources. The container alone holds 30% of all mineral reserves, 12% of known oil reserves, 8% of known natural gas, and 65% of the world's arable land. However, the power of Western multinational corporations and the lack of sufficient industrialization in most African countries has left the continent in a state of dependency on foreign countries. This condition of dependency was structured by the policies of the colonial rulers, who maintained economic activity in Africa based on the extraction and growth of raw materials, and then passed on to generations of post-colonial elites, who did nothing to change the structure. This state of continued economic dependency has created avenues for manipulation by these foreign governments who have a permanent interest in Africa. That's why, for instance, in return for land where a military base will be constructed, foreign countries such as the USA or the UK would offer aid to a particular African country where they desire to set up a base. In addition, the economic situation of countries in Africa has led to conflict issues, which have also given countries like the USA and France to set up military bases with the excuse that they are trying to settle conflicts. In reality, however, facts have shown that these countries set up their military bases close to where there are mineral resources in Africa. Take, for instance, the US military lily pad base in Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea. When asked, the US would say that the reason for this military base in the Gulf of Guinea is to reduce the growth of Islamic militancy, particularly ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But then the governments of these African countries agree that these groups do not have a threatening presence there. So why then does the US have a military base there? It's simply to protect the movement of Nigerian and Gulf of Guinea oil to the US. Another instance that justifies that foreign military bases are for the exploitation of African resources is what happened in 2007. During this year, about 1.7 billion barrels of oil were discovered at the border of Congo and Uganda in the Lake Albert region. And guess what happened next? This region became immediately militarized by the US Army. The second reason for foreign military bases in Africa is to stop the migration of Africans to European and Western countries. The IMF and World Bank-driven austerity programs and the failure of African states to manage resource sales in a way that provides decent lives for the population have resulted in large-scale migration across the continent. To stop this large-scale migration, and keep migrants as far as possible from their borders, Western countries set up their military bases in Africa, most especially in the Sahel region. And guess what? France claims that they set up the G5 Sahel initiative to help fight the terrorism crisis spreading across the region, but the truth is stopping the migration of Africans to their country is one of the major reasons why France assembled the G5 Sahel initiative, and also why the US built the large drone base in Agadez, which provides important aerial surveillance of migration in the region. Imagine the hypocrisy. The West wants African resources, but they do not want the African people. The third reason for foreign military bases, according to Lasiba Tefo, a political analyst, is in case of war. According to Lasiba, superpowers compete to at least have their deployments at strategic positions, so that should the need arise to go all out in any form of warfare, they will have access to resources and ammunition. This means if America decides to invade any African country, it would be very easy for them to do so. This is the reason for the Russia and Ukraine war. NATO wants to deploy its armaments in Ukraine so they can have the closest access should the need arise to attack Russia, but Russia did not allow it. It's truly baffling that African leaders allow foreign countries to set up military bases despite the risk. If it has any benefit, why doesn't the US have any foreign military base on its soil? This brings us to the point that the reason why all these foreign countries can easily set up military bases in Africa is because of Africa's weak government and weak institutions such as the African Union. The president of Djibouti is a perfect example of an African leader who has allowed different foreign countries, including the US, France, and China, to set up military bases in the country for some benefits. These benefits include the lease on the land, which is worth billions of dollars where the base will be set up, and also protection against opposition forces. Ghana is also another example. In 2018, the US Department of Defense proposed that the US and Ghana agree to a Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, a $20 million deal that would allow the US military to expand its presence in Ghana. This proposal, however, was met with disapproval by the population and the opposition party, which believed that this agreement would mean that there was a possibility that the US would build a military base in the country. And so, by April of the same year, the president of Ghana claimed that his government had not offered a military base and will not offer a military base to the United States of America. However, in May 2018, the SOFA agreement was signed, and from what can be observed from the binding document, the US is permitted to create its own military facilities in Ghana. By any definition, this means that it can set up a base. In recent times, there have been growing concerns about the increasing number of bases in the African continent, but sadly, that's where it ends. No action has been taken to stop these foreign countries from hosting their military base, something they would never allow African countries to do. It's obvious that these countries see the African continent as a weak child who would accept anything that is dished out to them. The African Union is not even helping matters. The fact that they depend on 98% of their funding from external partners such as the European Union limits their ability to stop the setting up of military bases by foreign countries. No true independent nation will willingly allow another country to set up a military base on its soil. From the time Western countries started setting up their bases on African soil, there have been calls by some African leaders to remove those bases because those foreign bases are a deviation from the anti-imperialist ideals of the struggles that brought independence to Africa. In 1964, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser called for the removal of these bases, and in 1970, after Colonel Muammar Gaddafi overthrew the monarchy, the bases were removed. In most recent times, some African leaders have also called for the removal of these bases. Speaking on the presence of the U.S. military base in Botswana and the launch of a U.S. Africa Command (AFRICOM) office in Zambia, Arkelio Sitoe of Mozambique told CAJ News Africa that, "I'm sure Botswana and Zambia's founding fathers of the armed liberation struggle against colonialism might be turning from their graves against current leaders shepherding these two countries. I think that the two presidents of Botswana and Zambia must prove they are not against the ethos, principles, values, and sentiments of what initially caused our forefathers to go to war of liberation against these same evil forces they are now inviting to set military bases in their respective countries. Otherwise, chances are high These two countries may sooner or later be labeled sellouts by future generations to come, he added. The leader of South Africa, EFF, Julius Malema, also commented on the U.S. military base in Botswana. He argued that the presence of the base in Botswana is a threat to not just South Africa but also the entire South African region. Malema then called for the removal of the base. Now that there seems to be an awakening across Africa, it's time for Africa to look into the issue of foreign military bases in the continent and do something about it. These bases do not serve the interest of the continent, and they threaten the sovereignty of African countries, therefore they are not needed. It's high time for all foreign military bases, most especially that of the US, to be removed and dismantled. All the foreign military forces in the continent should be sent packing the same way French forces were sent packing. These countries may claim that they are trying to help contain the security issues in Africa, but since they have been on the continent, nothing has changed. Instead, the security crisis has worsened, and so they have no legitimate reason to be on the continent. It's time to send them packing and let Africa deal with its problem by itself. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.